afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Dieltiens School. Special warm welcome to those who are joining us online, and for the guests are also joining us face to face. My name is Sana Ojambotla, and I am from CLTD. I am the facilitator for the session, and my colleague Veerle is joining me with moderating the chat. And today we are privileged to have our speaker, Veerle Dieltiens, and she will be speaking on decoloniality and curriculum relevance, revisiting the relevance of relevance. This is not just a timely conversation, but a pressing call to reflect on whose knowledge we center, how we frame relevance, and how we respond meaningfully to the voices and the histories that continue to shape our classrooms. So as we listen, we are invited to think beyond the echoes of the past struggles and to imagine possibilities of transformation and what curriculum relevance can truly look like when it is rooted in justice, inclusivity, and the lived realities of our students. So over to you.
Okay, so hello everybody, and it's lovely to speak to you all today. So what I have been thinking about is a little bit around relevance, and I'm going to talk a little bit about an honours course. But looking back at the bees must fall. Looking back at the bees must fall, one of the demands that was coming from the students was for a decolonized curriculum. And part of that demand was for a curriculum that was relevant. So for the decolonialists, universities had to be relevant in at least two ways. First, the curriculum had to reflect local knowledge, African indigenous knowledge systems in particular. And second, what they wanted is for what gets taught to be useful to the needs of developing countries and more specifically to the local. In fact, very, very much the local. So together, those two demands kind of can be summed up by saying what they were looking for was for universities to teach a curriculum that should offer African solutions for African problems. And the reason that this was important, the reason relevance is relevant, is first that there were pressing socioeconomic challenges. And so given these, we had to be pragmatic and sensible about what we teach, right? To teach something that is of little use is just a waste of resources. A second reason for why they wanted to go this route is that given the detrimental legacy of colonialism on identity and culture, there had to be redress for the injustices that had been done to the indigenous knowledge systems. So we cannot, as Ndlovu Gatsheni said, be saddled with irrelevant knowledge that disempowers rather than empowers individuals and communities. Moreover, there was this idea that Western knowledge was simply inadequate to solve local problems. And there was another reason, which is that if a curriculum was relevant or useful to individual students, it would offer epistemic access to those students. Since they would be able to relate to the content, it would be a way in for them into the curriculum. There's also a theme in the literature on the impact of relevant curriculum on student motivation. So there were many arguing in that literature that the more relevant the content is, the more motivated students would be to learn. Okay, these are all very compelling reasons for having relevant curriculum. But these reasons all fall and stumble into a critique that education is being used in an instrumental way, right? So in the arguments of the decolonialists, education is seen as a means to an end. In the same way that that neoliberalism is attacked for its subordination of education to profits, so decoloniality had recruited universities to solve the problems of coloniality. So the problems of the critique, or the problems of injustice, the critiques would say, should be dealt with politically or economically, not through the education system. Okay. So the instrumental argument assumes that education can actually achieve what its bidders want it to, without any real reckoning with the ontology of education. Education was being used by the decolonialists really to solve problems of injustice and decoloniality. And it's this instrumental argument that I think I'm trying to challenge here, but also move beyond. So what other alternatives are there? So there is a long tradition that goes way back to Aristotle that justifies education on intrinsic grounds. Education here has its own ontology. It's an end in itself rather than a means to an end. We educate for no other reason than that to be educated is better than to be not to be educated. We don't educate women so that they'll be better wives. We don't educate children to be better citizens or young people to be better workers. Education is simply a right that people have. The kind of curriculum that would support this intrinsic, or that supports this intrinsic argument for what we teach is often known as one that's built on worthwhile knowledge. It's worthwhile because it's seen to be valuable. It's deep and broad, and it's definitively not specialized. You wouldn't be called educated if you knew only one thing really well. You can't be a scientist and know no art. That would qualify you from being called educated. So if you think about one way of thinking about this is the kind of education of the leisured classes of Greece, who are studying arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And this is an argument that goes all the way from ancient Greek, but in the 1960s, R.S. Peters was most famously associated with it. And to be educated is not to have arrived at a destination. It is to travel with a different view. What is required is not feverish preparation for something that lies ahead, but to work with precision, passion, and taste at worthwhile things that lie in hand. So the idea here that there is no relevance in education is a really powerful defense of education. It says there's no instrumental reason behind what we do, why we teach. We teach because it's a good thing to be taught and to learn. And it's an incredibly powerful bulwark fought against AI, for example. So, and for those who've just come in, I've talked about how the decolonialists have argued for an education that was dependent on relevance. And I'm countering that with the argument that education should actually be, and that education should actually be justified on intrinsic grounds. The problem, of course, with this intrinsic justification for education is that it's very archaic, right? It's difficult to think of education today as only a contemplative activity. Even the ancient Greeks had trouble holding this line on education as having no extrinsic purpose, while recognizing that education was enjoyed only by free citizens to prepare them for public life. It turns out that contemplation is good for democracy. So there is always, in a sense, an intrinsic purpose. Immanuel Kant was a staunch defender of an intrinsic argument for education, but he too slips up when he says children ought to be educated, not for the present, but for a possibly improved condition of man in the future. That is, in a manner which is adapted to the idea of humanity and the whole destiny of man. So even his argument ends up saying that we're educating for some kind of future, rather than just educating for the here and now, and for the good of the individual at that moment. There is, of course, one other problem with the intrinsic argument that I've just laid out, and I'm sure it's one all of you are already thinking about, and that is that worthwhile knowledge is not well defined, but it does seem to be grounded or centered in Western knowledge. So although its proponents might argue that worthwhile knowledge is universal, it's worthwhile because it's necessary to live a worthwhile life. For decolonialists, the claim to universality is a sticking point because knowledge is always context specific. So you've got an idea of trying to think of how we justify what we teach on an instrumental argument, which I've said is a problem if it's used only instrumentally. And the problem with the intrinsic argument is that it doesn't really gel with what we do, right? We are in a sense always educating for a purpose. So I want to just take a side step here and talk about the course that brought me to the problem, to be thinking about the problem of relevance. So it's an honors course in educational theory. It covers epistemology and meta theories. Auguste Comte makes an appearance, so does Immanuel Kant. There are lectures on positivism, interpretivism, and political realism, along with Marxism. There's a section on liberalism and postmodernism. And a week on decoloniality has latterly been included. So it's a course that in many ways would irk the decolonialist. We've mashed in a little bit of decoloniality, but really this is a course of dead white men. And the students are warned in the course pack that this course offers a challenging, reading, intensive introduction to educational issues and debates. This is a course that is actually rationalized on intrinsic grounds, right? It's theory for theory's sake. In fact, it seems that when we teach this course, we assume that everybody's going to do a PhD. Even the essay questions that were given weren't really related to weren't really applicable to education. They weren't being applied to education problems. And yet this was an honors course in a very applied field in education. Surely we are educating students for some more practical purpose. When I surveyed the honours students this year to ask why they were doing the course, 18% said they wanted to work in a district or a provincial office. 16% wanted to improve themselves as teachers. 20% said they were doing it for self-development. There was a whole lot, actually, 14%, much more than would eventually do it, who said they wanted to do this for a PhD. The course, actually, rather dreadfully, I have to tell you, was a lot of those students, I think there was 79% were under the age of 30, and as many as 18% were called themselves teachers, and there was a whole bunch. I think it was, if I'm not correct, if I'm not thinking correct, it was 8% of them called themselves unemployed. And when I looked at the statistics carefully, it actually turned out that the majority of our students, of our honours students, were unemployed teachers from the year before. They were fourth-year students who just hadn't found a job, and so that kind of stumbled back into doing an honours course. So I think we needed to really think about what it was we were doing. Why were we doing this course? And I think if we imagine that what we were doing is developing a leadership in the education system, from schools to district offices to provincial to national offices, we have to think about if we're educating for the next layer of education bureaucrats, what is it that we wanted to teach them? And how would we rationalize why we were teaching them that without falling into the traps that I've just explained of instrumentalism and of irrelevance? So I think we needed to think about not just what we were teaching, but first think about the justification of what we were doing. And one way, I don't know if anybody wants to think about what alternative way of justification there might be, if not an instrumentalist one, and not one that was intrinsic. So I think that we needed an argument that captures the strengths of both the instrumentalists and the intrinsic arguments, and the least of their flaws. And the argument that I would go with is that we really should be thinking about that what we're doing is educating our students to become autonomous. So autonomy is what we want. What we want are students who will become future bureaucrats, future researchers, future principals in schools, HODs in schools, that have a sense of justice, but are not supplicants to the government or to industry. We definitely want them to be able to think critically, which means that we want them to be able to survey many options in making their decisions in the future, understand the benefits and drawbacks of each, and make reasoned decisions. They have to be able to read research. They need to be able to judge evidence and to come to conclusions. And they have to do that with critical reason. So in this way, the course has a purpose. We are not shrugging the fact that we are teaching students with specific ideals. But we're not prescribing how students fulfill that purpose. In a way, we want students to be able to be autonomous thinkers, bureaucrats of the future. And that is quite it's a way in which what we try to do is think about this course. So So the other thing I wanted to talk, so how does this change the content of the course? If we think about this as what we're doing, I don't think necessarily that the content would change very much. They would still need to know epistemology. They would still need to know the theory. I think, though, what would change is that the way in which we assess the students and is that there would be far more application in our assessments of students and thinking about how they use those theories in the assessments. Yeah, so that is where I'm going to end. I was going to try open this up as a workshop so that I don't get too many questions. So I ask you about about your courses and the relevance of your courses. Maybe I should take some questions. I know some people came in late, so I hope you followed the presentation from its attempt to think about the decolonialists and the ways that they justify curriculum to an intrinsic approach to thinking and then thinking about it differently and how to
You have a question, and they say you should never ask a question if you don't know the answer, but I don't. I really don't. But maybe others in the room would. So you mentioned, and I mean, education's so far away from our field, but you mentioned the dead white men. Are there not also dead non-white people who could add to this? I really have no answer. I don't know whether or not one could include something like that in your course. Teachers, people from.
So yeah. Always my approach in trying to think about teaching is, and which is why I'm taken by the idea of worthwhile knowledge, I have to say, is as the intrinsic approach, is because education should always be beyond the here and now. And as much, in a way, what you want is to do, you want to grab as much as possible. There will always obviously be, you're not going to be able to do everything. There will be selection. But, I think to be as broad and deep as possible is what you want to do. So yes, you can add as much as you could in a way of different perspectives. And I think that the education for autonomy is also very, very much about trying to teach people different perspectives, as many different perspectives as possible, because the responsibility of an autonomous person is to be able to understand many viewpoints and to be able to make their own, to choose their own. But that choice is always determined on being able to survey lots of viewpoints. So in that way, I might be pretty.
Thank you so much. For me, I understand your justification, I should say. I understand what you're trying to get us to think about in terms of the education being, the bigger kind of purpose than just, where we are right now. But I'm just wondering whether it's even possible, because from what you're saying already, you're saying the students who were in this course are themselves unemployed. And they're not run away from the fact that people are wanting to get educated just to get a job. And so it seems to me it will be quite a long way before we can start thinking about the luxury of, educating for what you are saying. Do you understand what I'm saying?
And that's a really good insight, musical, because that's where the decolonialists come from, right?
Yes.
We have pressing, so
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
and we have to deal immediately with
them.
those. With those, and so you are pointing to a tension a little bit in where I end up. But I would still want to argue that the responsibility of education is to develop autonomous individuals. And so, yeah, I mean, I would probably need a few lines extra to try and defend myself against what I think is a really important problem that you were raising, and which is what stirs the decoloniality argument. That this is a luxury, but I would say it's not. Okay. I would say it's not a luxury. We need people who make the right decisions, and I think they can only make right decisions if they have the full, yeah, if they can think critically. Yeah, so for me, critical thinking is really is a really central aim for education, and that goes with autonomy.
Just gonna say that I did that course and I think
I can't hear you.
oh sorry, I was saying I did that course myself in 2017, and I think learning all those other theories, I think for me personally was important again. How you write and how you think about each. In 2017, long time ago. But I did it for an interesting time, right? Long time ago, but so I'm just thinking now, like it did, because those other people I studied with during that time, most of them they doing the PhD, but then it did allow for critical thinking about even legal and about all these theories and stuff. So I think it was important depending on the route you were taking in terms of your career as well. I mean, even just you wrote your masters, and if you've done those courses, that specific course for education, for example, I think it did force you to think differently or more critically about things, even about decolonization, transformation, instead of just looking at the surface level or what it means, but the challenge. So,
yeah, and you are reflecting on a lot. Again, I interviewed students from last year to find, before I started coordinating this course, I interviewed students from last year to ask them what they thought of the course. And I thought they would tell me it was horrible and theoretical and too difficult. I mean, it really is a course that was too difficult. They were reading like 5 works by Foucault and, you know, Marx's reply to Feuerbach was their first reading on Marx. It was like a really, but in fact, all the students I interviewed said it was a fabulous course. It challenged them very much. So, you know, yeah, I guess I can't remember. Yeah, but still, I think you really needed to ask the question: is this course relevant?
I was just thinking that, looking at your slide on intrinsic justifications for education, where it says education is an end in itself rather than a means to an end. And thinking, how can education be an end in itself rather than means to an end? And also basing it on our socio-economic problems that are still prevailing, by the way. I'm asking myself, when does education start and when does it end? When we start getting education from our parents, from our homes, from things that maybe we have not yet been exposed to in higher education. But then by the time you go to higher education, now it adds to whatever education that you've been given by the parents, by the society, you know, because you continue to learn I don't know if I'm having it this wrong. By the time you come to university, you already have some education that you're growing up with. So obviously, university now is sort of picking up where it can now augment or increase or deepen your knowledge. And perhaps now, when we talk about autonomy, then you suggest that university we should teach for autonomy, so that that young student now who comes for education in the university learns to take from all that they're learning, what is best for me, what is applicable, what is it that can I use for the future? Because at the end of the day, as much as you learn today, you still need to think of the future. So to me, when it says education is an end, I guess it's kind of confusing to me, because I'm feeling like education is a journey to take you to where you want to be. If you want to go, I think somebody was talking about when you come into the university the first year, you come with dreams, with goals, with ambitions, you want to change the world. Well, all of those, what do they call them in English? Rose-colored glasses. You have all of these things that you want to do in the world. But then you learn, you grow, you learn from every corner of the university that the world is not as actually what you thought it to be. So therefore, this education, what is it that is going to do to you or do for you, do for your community? Because we still live in communities that still need, that are still affected by socioeconomic factors. It's South Africa. It's not just diverse in race and color, it's diverse in economy. So I'm just saying that perhaps then we should relook at what is education, number one. And number two, if we teach for autonomy, what is it that we teach the students so that even if you drop up at the second year, you can still use part of that university learning if you find yourself, because there's some unforeseen circumstances that force students to leave the university. So if you leave the university, unlike those students who had to come back to your class because they have not gotten any jobs, now they're forced to come back inside and maybe with the hope that once they have honors, they'll be employable. Maybe I'm waffling, but I was just thinking that don't we teach for a purpose, towards a reason? If you're going to change the world, there's got to be a purpose from what you learn. I'm waffling, don't worry.
I think that's what my presentation was trying to do, was to show two different accounts of justifying education. One was the decoloniality. I always can't say it. The decoloniality argument, which is that education must have is an instrument for some other purpose. Yeah. And the argument there is, well, if you can't actually expect education to solve the problems of decoloniality or of colonialism. Those are problems that need to be dealt with by the politicians or by the economies. And I think the Marxists agree with me, right? The real problem with colonization is materialism, is the material impact that it's had. And for the decolonialists, much of what they have focused on is the cultural and the identity issues in the curriculum. But and I think those are important. I want to hold, I want that some of that needs to be addressed. But education can't solve all the problems of coloniality. And I think that's kind of what I'm signaling there, that we're using education as an instrument to try and solve the problems of colonialism is to misunderstand what education can and can't do. And then to say, well, the opposite of that would be to say, can education be an end in itself, right? And that argument goes back all the way to Aristotle, and it's an argument that is picked up to the Enlightenment in Kant, and and to R.S. Peters and Paul Hirst in the 1960s. That argument for it, that there is, so what I was trying to say is, I think that that's a very powerful argument in defense for education, but it slips, but it's very hard to hold on to, because even, as I said, even Aristotle, even Immanuel Kant, even the liberals of the 1960s kind of end up saying, yes, but you need education for political, to make people vote in a democracy.
Yeah.
You can't, so there's always, in a sense, they always end up having a reason for it. So what I'm trying to say is that we do need to have a justification, because having a justification for what you teach, for having a justification for why you teach, being able to explain why you teach, will give you a handle on what you teach. So that's what I'm coming to in this. I hope that makes sense. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that we try and have a justification. It bridges both the intrinsic and the extrinsic arguments for education. And then that argument is one that is for autonomy.
Okay.
And I haven't had anybody say that is wrong. I think there will be people who will say it's wrong. And I think that it will come from like one or the other of my opinions in this piece.
You were just mentioning about how it's I was just struggling. I was just thinking the entire time when you were even about what we are doing by. So now the question mentioned in my opinion is that how do you define curriculum? What is curriculum? You said in a way that it's always curriculum. You kind of think, well, what you bring to the curriculum could be you, could be a student, and it's also the elective experiences, the minds, the body. So how do you learn that and how do you define it?
My favorite thing has been from the mind and body, and especially curriculum. But I mean, I think that I worry less about what I kind of come to at the end is I worry less about the content of the curriculum, as long as what we get is a kind of range of views that that students learn to think through critically. I mean, that's sort of the bottom line for me. And I think that is as much as many viewpoints as possible is what we need to get into the curriculum. One of the changes I made this year in the education honours course is to add more in. It didn't mean I kind of flattened things out of it. They didn't have to read Marx's response to Feuerbach. So they didn't go deep into Marxism, but they got more perspectives, and maybe a little less depth. But I was hoping that getting more perspective meant that they could start to see education problems from more than just one or two perspectives that they were being encompassed. So that, in terms of curriculum, that's what I did.
We're out of time, but yeah. Let's have one question. I'm not sure if I'm confused or I missed something. Earlier on, when you presented, you said the purpose of education is to liberate men. The purpose of education, is it to liberate men?
It's not what I said, no.
It's not to liberate men.
To liberate?
A person is to liberate men.
I'm not quite sure what I mean by that.
I'm not sure if
I've heard this from, or I heard it from someone, but I always hear people saying education. You educate people to liberate people. Now, you are saying that we cannot use education to answer political problems. When we do research as researchers, we are saying we do research to solve social problems, and that's the purpose. And I want to believe as well that the purpose of education is to solve problems that are out there. And if then education cannot answer political challenges, political issues, which sphere, which discipline, who must talk to those problems? I don't know.
So your question helps me come to where I was going to my conclusion, right? Which is that I think that we do need to match purpose with, so we do need to try to match purpose with the intrinsic defense qualification. And I think that autonomy does that. So what we want is autonomous individuals who are able to solve problems in South Africa. There's definite, so I'm not, so where I get to is that education does have a purpose. It's not entirely intrinsic, but it does hold on to something very fundamental about what education is, right? It holds on to the account for an intrinsic argument is that you can't be, that education is for critical thinking and for autonomy. So you can't teach people how to solve the problem. What you can do is give them the instruments on how to think. I'm getting my tongue tied here, but I want to give them. They need to be able to read, write, and think, right, and to make decisions and to understand a whole range of views, so they can make the decisions to solve problems. But you're not going to tell them exactly how to do it. Does that make sense? I'm trying to avoid education becoming an instrument of any particular ideology, or ideology is too big a word, but any obvious solution. But that, yeah. So that's how I'm trying to bring these two things together in the idea of autonomy. I don't know if I was
Yes.